Morning mist rises from the gentle curves of the Tiber River, carrying with it the whispers of ancient stories that have echoed along these banks for nearly 3 millennia. The water moves slowly here, winding through 7 low hills that rise like sleeping giants from the Italian countryside, their slopes covered in oak and olive trees that have watched the passage of countless seasons. In the early light, the landscape appears timeless, as if the very stones remember the footsteps of shepherds and kings, of gods walking among mortals in those distant days when the world was younger and more mysterious. The river itself seems to hold memories in its flowing waters, carrying them downstream past marshy lowlands where herons stand motionless among the reeds, their reflections rippling in the current. Along these same banks, according to the stories passed down through generations of Roman mothers to their children, a basket once floated containing twin infants whose destiny would reshape the ancient world. The tale speaks of Romulus and Remus, abandoned to the mercy of the waters by a king's cruel command, their royal blood flowing through tiny veins as they drifted helplessly toward an uncertain fate. In the realm of myth, the she-wolf emerges as both fierce protector and tender nurse, her amber eyes scanning the riverbank for threats, while the foundling brothers suckle at her side. The Romans would later carve her image in bronze and marble, immortalizing the moment when wild nature reached across the divide to nurture human destiny. Under her watchful care, nestled in a cave that legend places near the base of the Palatine Hill, the twins grow strong on wolf's milk and the protective warmth of their unusual foster mother. The shepherd Faustulus eventually discovers them there, his weathered hands gentle as he lifts the children from their primitive sanctuary and carries them to his humble dwelling. These foundational stories weave together the earthly and the divine, for the twins' mother, Rhea Silvia, was said to be a Vestal virgin who had caught the attention of Mars, the god of war himself. In the shadowy realm where mortal women encountered immortal desires, she bore children whose very existence challenged the established order. Her uncle, King Amulius, had seized power from her father and commanded that any offspring of the royal line be destroyed, fearing prophecies that spoke of restoration and revenge. Yet the river refused to be the instrument of infanticide, instead becoming the pathway to salvation. The archaeological evidence whispers its own stories from the layers of earth that have accumulated over centuries along these 7 hills. Deep beneath the later grandeur of marble temples and paved streets, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of simple settlements dating back to the 8th century before the Common Era. These early communities chose their locations with the wisdom of people who understood the land intimately, positioning themselves on elevated ground that offered both protection from floods and commanding views of the surrounding territory. The hilltops provided natural fortification, while the valley floors offered fertile soil for growing grain and vegetables. Pottery fragments emerge from excavated sites like scattered pages from an ancient diary, their rough surfaces bearing the fingerprints of craftsmen whose names have been lost to time. These vessels once held olive oil pressed from groves on the surrounding hillsides, wine made from grapes that grew in terraced vineyards, and grain ground from wheat that swayed in fields beyond the settlement walls. Bronze fibulae, the safety pins of the ancient world, still gleamed dully when cleaned of their patina, having once fastened the woolen cloaks of shepherds who drove their flocks to pasture each morning. The earliest inhabitants lived in simple huts with walls of wattle and daub, their roofs thatched with straw that rustled softly in the Mediterranean breezes. Smoke rose from central hearths, where families gathered in the evening to share meals and stories, the flickering firelight casting dancing shadows on clay-covered walls. Outside, the streets were narrow pathways worn smooth by countless feet, winding between buildings that seemed to have grown organically from the landscape itself. Wells provided fresh water drawn from underground springs, their stone edges worn smooth by the ropes of countless water carriers. Trade routes already crisscrossed this region when the first permanent settlements took root along the Tiber's banks. Merchants traveling between the Greek colonies in the south and the Etruscan cities to the north would pause at river crossings, their pack animals heavily laden with amphorae of wine, bolts of dyed cloth, and ingots of precious metals. The strategic position of these early communities made them natural stopping points where travelers could find food, shelter, and fresh supplies for the journey ahead. Salt, that precious commodity essential for preserving meat and flavoring food, traveled along ancient paths from coastal salt pans to inland markets, passing through settlements that would learn to profit from their position astride these vital commercial arteries. The Etruscans, whose sophisticated civilization flourished to the north, cast long shadows over these emerging communities along the Tiber. Their influence flowed southward like water seeking lower ground, bringing with them knowledge of metalworking, architectural techniques, and religious practices that would become woven into the fabric of Roman culture. Etruscan kings may have ruled over some of these early settlements, their court centers of learning and artisanship, where young Romans absorbed lessons in statecraft and ceremony. The very name Roma might derive from an Etruscan word, though the mists of time have obscured its precise origins. Within the mythological framework that would later define Roman identity, the rivalry between Romulus and Remus reaches its tragic climax as the brothers mature into leaders of men. Each gathers followers and seeks divine confirmation of his right to found a new city on the banks of the Tiber. The auguries, those ancient methods of reading the will of the gods through the flight of birds and other natural omens, seem to favor first one brother and then the other. The tension builds like storm clouds gathering over the 7 hills until it breaks in violence, brother's hand raised against brother in a moment that would haunt Roman consciousness throughout their empire's long history. The death of Remus, whether through fratricide or the harsh justice of violated boundaries, removes the final obstacle to Romulus's singular vision. On April 21st, according to tradition, he traces the sacred boundary of his new city with a bronze plough, the furrow marking the limits within which Roman law would hold sway. The pomoerium, this sacred boundary, becomes more than a simple line in the earth. It represents the fundamental distinction between the civilized space within the city walls and the wild world that lies beyond them. Here, where shepherds once drove their flocks and farmers tended their fields, rises the first iteration of what will become the eternal city. Archaeological layers tell a more complex story than the neat narratives of myth, revealing a gradual coalescence of various tribal groups and settlements into larger political entities. The process unfolded over generations rather than years, marked by intermarriage between communities, shared religious festivals, and cooperative defense against external threats. Trade relationships strengthened into political alliances, and temporary agreements evolved into permanent confederations. The landscape itself shaped these developments, as the natural boundaries of hills and rivers defined territories while fertile valleys encouraged agricultural specialization and surplus production that could support non-farming populations. The 7 hills, Palatine, Aventine, Capitoline, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, and Caelian, each contributed their own communities to the emerging urban center. On the Palatine, archaeological evidence suggests continuous habitation from at least the 8th century, while the Capitoline would later become the religious heart of the expanding city. Between the hills, in the marshy ground that would eventually become the Roman Forum, early inhabitants drained swampland and established marketplaces where farmers and craftsmen could exchange their goods. The transformation of landscape through human ingenuity began here, in these modest drainage projects that would eventually grow into the massive engineering works for which Rome became renowned throughout the ancient world. As dawn broke over the 7 hills in those distant centuries, the morning light would catch the smoke rising from countless hearths where families gathered around flickering flames that had burned continuously through generations of royal rule. The Etruscan kings who had shaped Rome's early destiny ruled from their palaces on the Palatine Hill, their bronze-fitted doors opening to reveal chambers adorned with precious metals and ivory, where the scent of imported incense mingled with the leather and oil that permeated the Roman world. These monarchs, draped in purple-dyed wool that spoke of wealth beyond the means of ordinary citizens, walked marble floors inlaid with patterns that echoed the geometric designs found in distant Greek temples, their footsteps echoing through corridors where power had crystallized into ritual and ceremony. The last of these kings, Tarquinius Superbus, whose very name would echo through history as a synonym for tyranny, ruled with the absolute authority that had become as natural to Roman kingship as the flowing of the Tiber itself. His palace walls, painted with frescoes depicting conquered enemies and tribute-bearing provinces, enclosed a world where the king's word carried the weight of divine mandate, where his bronze-tipped scepter could determine the fate of any citizen with a gesture as simple as pointing toward the forum or away from it. The air within these royal chambers grew heavy with the accumulated power of generations, thick with the perfume of oriental spices and the metallic scent of the silver vessels that held wine from distant vineyards, while beyond the palace windows, the city sprawled in terraced levels down toward the river, where merchants and artisans pursued their trades under the watchful eyes of the king's appointed officials. In the sprawling marketplaces below, where the cobblestones grew smooth under the constant passage of sandaled feet and wooden cart wheels, conversations began to take on new undertones during the final years of royal rule. The voices of senators, whose togas were woven from the finest wool and whose hands bore the calluses of sword practice as much as the ink stains of administrative work, carried a different quality when they spoke in the shaded porticos surrounding the forum, their words carefully chosen and their glances frequently directed toward the Palatine Hill where the king held court. These men, descendants of the earliest Roman families whose ancestors had fought alongside Romulus and whose genealogies stretched back through the mists of legend, found themselves increasingly at odds with a royal authority that seemed to grow more distant from the customs and values that had built Rome from a collection of hilltop villages into a power that commanded respect throughout central Italy. The tension that would eventually rupture the foundations of monarchy had been building like water behind a dam, accumulating pressure through seasons of discontent that manifested in subtle ways throughout the city. In the workshops where bronze smiths hammered out agricultural tools and weapons, their conversations punctuated by the rhythmic striking of metal against metal, discussions increasingly turned to questions of justice and representation that would have been unthinkable in earlier generations. The wine shops that lined the narrow streets leading up from the Tiber, their interiors dim and cool even during the heat of summer afternoons, became gathering places where citizens debated the proper relationship between ruler and ruled, their voices mixing with the sound of wine pouring into clay cups and the distant lowing of cattle being driven to market. The final catalyst for change came wrapped in personal tragedy and public outrage, when the actions of the royal family crossed the invisible line that separated acceptable autocracy from intolerable tyranny. The story of Lucretia, whose virtue became both her doom and Rome's salvation, spread through the city like fire through dry grain, carried from household to household by women drawing water at public fountains and men conducting business in the shadow of ancient temples. Her violation by the king's son and her subsequent suicide, performed with a dagger drawn across her throat in full view of her husband and father, created a moment of moral clarity that cut through years of accumulated resentment and political calculation like a blade through silk. The conspirators who gathered in the pre-dawn darkness to plan the overthrow of monarchy met in places where the old gods still held sway, where the scent of burnt offerings lingered in chambers lit by oil lamps that cast flickering shadows on walls painted with scenes of Roman valor. Lucius Junius Brutus, whose name would resonate through history as the founder of republican government, moved through these clandestine meetings with the careful precision of a man who understood that the actions of the next few days would determine not only his own fate, but the destiny of generations yet unborn. His fellow conspirators, men whose families had served Rome for centuries under kings, but who now found themselves ready to reimagine the very nature of Roman governance, spoke in whispers that carried the weight of revolution, their plans taking shape like bronze cooling in a mold, solidifying into something permanent and transformative. The actual expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus unfolded with a swiftness that surprised even those who had orchestrated it, as if the Roman people had been waiting for generations for someone to voice what everyone had been thinking but no one had dared to say. The king's departure from the city he had ruled was marked not by the clash of arms or the burning of palaces, but by an almost ceremonial emptiness, as if Rome itself had simply exhaled and released the last remnant of monarchical authority into the morning air. The palace doors, which had opened and closed on the commands of kings for more than 2 centuries, stood vacant and slightly ajar, their bronze fittings catching the light but no longer reflecting the presence of absolute power. In the immediate aftermath of this transformation, as the dust of political upheaval settled over the 7 hills, like the fine powder that rose from newly plowed fields, the men who had engineered the revolution faced the monumental task of creating something entirely new from the institutional foundations of the old. The Senate, which had existed as an advisory body under the kings, suddenly found itself elevated to a position of unprecedented authority, its members gathering in their traditional meeting place with the knowledge that their deliberations would no longer be subject to royal veto or contradiction. The familiar rituals of Roman political life took on new meaning, as these senators, their togas arranged in the traditional manner but their faces reflecting the gravity of unprecedented responsibility, began the work of constructing a republic. The creation of the consulship, with its revolutionary principle of shared authority and limited terms, emerged from these early republican discussions like a sculpture taking shape under a master craftsman's tools, each feature carefully considered and deliberately formed to prevent the concentration of power that had made tyranny possible. 2 men would now stand where 1 king had previously ruled, their authority balanced against each other in a system designed to ensure that neither could accumulate the kind of absolute power that had corrupted their predecessors. The sacred ritual by which these consuls would take office, surrounded by the traditional symbols of Roman authority, but exercising that authority under entirely new constraints, marked not just a change in government, but a transformation in the Roman understanding of power itself. The early years of the Republic unfolded against a backdrop of uncertainty and experimentation, as Rome's new leaders navigated the challenges of governing without the clear lines of authority that monarchy had provided. The Forum, which had served as a marketplace and gathering place under the kings, gradually transformed into the beating heart of republican government, its open spaces filled with the voices of citizens debating policy and law with a freedom that would have been impossible under royal rule. The bronze tablets on which new laws were inscribed and displayed caught the sunlight as they were mounted in public places, their metal surfaces reflecting not just light but the revolutionary idea that governance could be transparent and accountable to those who were governed. The newly formed republic stood at the threshold of a destiny that would reshape the Mediterranean world, though its citizens could scarcely have imagined the magnitude of what lay ahead. In those early decades following the expulsion of the kings, Rome was merely one city-state among many in the complex tapestry of Italian politics, surrounded by neighbors who viewed the fledgling republic with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and opportunistic calculation. The Etruscan cities to the north maintained their ancient commercial networks and cultural sophistication, while the Greek colonies of the south, Magna Graecia, as they called it, continued to regard themselves as the true inheritors of Hellenic civilization. Between these two spheres of influence, the central Italian tribes pursued their own ambitions, their warriors gathering in hill fortresses that had watched over the peninsula's valleys for generations beyond memory. The Roman approach to expansion emerged not as a single grand strategy conceived in marble halls, but as a gradual evolution of pragmatic responses to immediate challenges. Each conflict seemed to arise naturally from the last, creating an almost organic progression that would eventually encompass the entire peninsula. The Romans possessed an unusual gift for transforming military victory into lasting political advantage, understanding that conquest meant nothing without the delicate art of integration. Where other ancient powers relied primarily on subjugation and tribute, Rome developed something far more sophisticated, a flexible system of alliances that could absorb former enemies and transform them into partners in future endeavors. The Latin League provided the first laboratory for this emerging Roman genius. These neighboring cities, bound by common language and customs, had long cooperated in religious festivals and mutual defense against external threats. Rome's growing influence within this confederation demonstrated an early mastery of diplomatic subtlety, gradually assuming leadership not through naked force, but through careful cultivation of relationships and strategic marriages between noble families. The Romans understood that true power lay not merely in the ability to compel obedience, but in the capacity to make their leadership seem both natural and beneficial to those who accepted it. This delicate balance between persuasion and intimidation would become the hallmark of Roman expansion throughout Italy. The Samnite Wars marked the first great test of Roman resolve and adaptability, stretching across nearly half a century of intermittent conflict that reshaped both societies. The Samnites were mountain warriors, fierce and independent, who controlled the strategic passes between northern and southern Italy. Their confederacy represented everything that Rome was learning to become, a union of related tribes that had discovered strength through cooperation while maintaining their distinct identities. The conflict began over control of Campania, that fertile region around modern Naples, where Greek influence met Italian ambition, and where control meant access to some of the richest agricultural land in the peninsula. The first encounters revealed the limitations of traditional Roman tactics against an enemy that refused to fight conventional battles. Samnite warriors preferred the guerrilla warfare of their mountain homeland, striking swiftly from hidden positions before melting back into terrain they had known since childhood. The disaster at the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE, where Roman legions found themselves trapped in a narrow pass and forced to surrender, demonstrated that military innovation would be essential for survival. The humiliation of Roman soldiers passing beneath the yoke, a ritual submission that violated every principle of Roman dignity, burned itself into the collective memory and strengthened the Republic's resolve to master new forms of warfare. Recovery came through the systematic development of military engineering and tactical flexibility that would characterize Roman expansion for centuries to come. The legions learned to build roads that could support rapid troop movement while simultaneously serving as instruments of political control, connecting conquered territories to the growing network of Roman influence. Fortified camps became temporary cities that could anchor Roman presence in hostile territory, their precise geometric layouts reflecting the order that Rome sought to impose upon the world. The manipular system replaced the rigid phalanx formations inherited from earlier Greek influence, creating smaller, more maneuverable units that could adapt to varied terrain and enemy tactics, while maintaining the disciplined cohesion that remained distinctly Roman. The conquest of the Etruscans proceeded through a different rhythm entirely, marked more by the gradual erosion of an ancient civilization than the dramatic clashes that characterized the Samnite Wars. Etruscan cities had grown wealthy through trade and manufacturing, their elaborate tombs filled with evidence of sophisticated artistic achievement and far-reaching commercial connections. Yet this very prosperity may have contributed to their downfall, as success bred a comfortable aristocracy more interested in maintaining established privileges than adapting to changing circumstances. Roman expansion into Etruscan territory often resembled a slow strangulation, cutting trade routes and isolating individual cities until resistance became economically impossible rather than militarily defeated. The siege of Veii demonstrated Roman patience and engineering capability on an unprecedented scale, lasting nearly a decade, and requiring innovations that would serve the Republic well in future campaigns. Roman engineers learned to drain marshes, divert rivers, and construct siege works of remarkable complexity, treating warfare as a technical challenge requiring systematic solutions, rather than merely an arena for individual heroics. The eventual capture of Veii brought not only immense wealth into Roman coffers, but also provided a template for dealing with other fortified positions throughout Italy. More importantly, the integration of Veientine territory into the Roman system established precedents for land distribution and colonial organization that would guide expansion for generations. Southern Italy presented entirely different challenges, as Roman ambitions eventually collided with the Greek cities that had maintained their independence and cultural identity for centuries. These colonies had produced philosophers, mathematicians, and artists whose reputations extended throughout the Mediterranean world, yet their political fragmentation left them vulnerable to unified pressure from the expanding Roman Confederation. The Greek response to Roman expansion reflected their own internal contradictions, simultaneous pride in their cultural achievements and recognition of their military limitations against an opponent that seemed to grow stronger with each victory. The invitation of Pyrrhus of Epirus to defend Tarentum against Roman expansion brought the Republic face-to-face with Hellenistic military science at its most sophisticated. Pyrrhus arrived with elephants, professional cavalry, and tactical innovations developed in the aftermath of Alexander's conquests, representing everything that Roman armies had not yet encountered. The battles that followed, at Heraclea and Asculum, demonstrated both Roman resilience and the limitations of purely military solutions to political problems. Pyrrhus could win engagements through superior generalship and equipment, but Roman society possessed a depth of resources and commitment that could absorb tactical defeats while maintaining strategic pressure. The withdrawal of Pyrrhus marked more than military victory. It represented the triumph of Roman political organization over individual brilliance. Where Greek warfare depended heavily on exceptional leadership and professional soldiers, Roman success grew from systematic preparation and the ability to mobilize entire communities for extended campaigns. The Roman approach to casualties reflected this fundamental difference. Losses that might cripple a Greek army served merely to strengthen Roman determination, as the citizen soldiers understood themselves to be fighting for their own future, rather than merely serving the ambitions of distant kings. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, Roman control extended throughout the Italian peninsula, yet this expansion had transformed Rome as much as it had changed the territories brought under Roman influence. The Republic had evolved from a city-state defending its immediate surroundings into the center of a confederation that stretched from the Alps to the southern seas, bound together by a complex web of treaties, colonies, and shared interests that had no parallel in the ancient world. This transformation established the foundation for everything that would follow, creating the institutional framework and accumulated experience that would soon project Roman power across the Mediterranean and into the pages of history. The echoes of Roman conquest across the Italian peninsula had barely settled when the Republic's expanding influence began to brush against another rising power, one that had been spreading its own tentacles across the Mediterranean for centuries. Carthage, the great maritime empire founded by Phoenician settlers, commanded the seas with fleets that carried purple-dyed sails and holds filled with silver, spices, and slaves. From their magnificent harbor city on the North African coast, Carthaginian merchants had established trading posts from Spain to Sicily, creating a commercial network that rivaled Rome's growing territorial dominance. The two powers moved through their respective spheres like great celestial bodies, their gravitational pull growing stronger as their orbits inevitably began to intersect. Sicily became the first point of friction, that triangular island floating between Italy and Africa, like a precious stone dropped into azure waters. The island's strategic position made it irresistible to both powers, and when the Mamertines, Italian mercenaries who had seized control of Messana, appealed for Roman protection against Carthaginian interference, the die was cast with a sound that would echo through centuries. The Senate's decision to respond marked Rome's first significant venture beyond the Italian mainland, a momentous step that transformed what had been a regional power into something far greater and more dangerous. The First Punic War unfolded across nearly a quarter century, from 264 to 241 BCE. As both republics discovered that their conflict would demand innovations neither had anticipated, Rome, master of land warfare, found itself forced to become a naval power almost overnight. The sound of hammers rang out in Roman shipyards as craftsmen studied captured Carthaginian vessels, learning to build their own quinqueremes with 5 banks of oars and bronze-reinforced prows designed for ramming. Roman ingenuity produced the corvus, a boarding bridge that could crash down onto enemy vessels, transforming sea battles into the kind of close-quarters combat where Roman discipline and swordwork could prevail over Carthaginian seamanship. The waters around Sicily became graveyards for ships and men as massive fleets clashed beneath Mediterranean skies. At Mylae, Roman naval forces tasted their first victory at sea, the corvus proving its worth as Roman marines poured across the boarding bridges onto Carthaginian decks. The victories accumulated slowly, each one teaching Roman commanders more about the rhythms of naval warfare, the importance of weather patterns, and the deadly mathematics of supply lines stretched across open water. Yet for every triumph, disaster seemed to follow, as storms claimed entire fleets, and the Romans learned the harsh lesson that the sea demanded its own form of respect. Carthage's response came in the form of brilliant commanders who understood that Rome's strength lay in its methodical, systematic approach to conquest. Hamilcar Barca, whose very name would become synonymous with Carthaginian resistance, transformed warfare into something more fluid and unpredictable. His campaigns in Sicily demonstrated a new kind of fighting, using speed and surprise to strike at Roman supply lines and then melting away into the mountainous interior before Roman legions could respond. The Carthaginian general's tactics foreshadowed a more personal and bitter phase of the conflict that would involve his family for generations to come. The war's resolution came not through decisive battle but through gradual exhaustion, as both powers found their treasuries drained and their populations weary of constant mobilization. The final Roman naval victory at the Agates Islands in 241 BCE sealed Carthage's fate, forcing the maritime empire to abandon Sicily and pay an enormous indemnity that would strain Carthaginian resources for years to come. Rome's transformation was complete. The Republic now possessed not just Italian allies, but an overseas province, requiring new forms of administration and creating appetites for further expansion that would prove impossible to satisfy. The interval between the first and second conflicts witnessed both powers adapting to their new relationship while nursing grievances that festered like untreated wounds. Hamilcar's son Hannibal grew to manhood in Spain, where his father had built a new Carthaginian power base using silver mines and Iberian warriors to replace what had been lost in Sicily. Roman traders and diplomats watched nervously as reports arrived of the young commander's brilliance, his ability to weld disparate tribal warriors into disciplined armies, and his apparent inheritance of his father's burning hatred for Rome. The Second Punic War erupted in 218 BCE, when Hannibal's assault on Saguntum, a Roman ally in Spain, provided the casus belli both sides had been expecting. What followed defied every strategic assumption both powers had made about how the conflict would unfold. Instead of meeting Roman forces in Spain or waiting for Roman naval power to transport legions to Africa, Hannibal embarked on one of history's most audacious campaigns, leading an army of Carthaginians, Libyans, Iberians, and war elephants across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and over the Alps into the heart of Roman Italy. The crossing itself became legendary, as Hannibal's diverse armies struggled through mountain passes where ice-cold streams ran between towering peaks, and the air grew thin enough to leave men gasping. The elephants, those living symbols of Carthaginian power, suffered terribly in the alpine cold, their tropical blood unable to adapt to the harsh conditions. By the time the army descended into the Po Valley, it had been reduced by more than half, yet what remained represented something unprecedented in Roman experience. A professional army led by tactical genius, operating in the Roman heartland with the support of Gallic tribes eager for revenge against their conquerors. The battles that followed demonstrated Hannibal's revolutionary approach to warfare. his ability to turn Roman strengths into weaknesses through superior positioning and timing. At Trebia, Roman legions found themselves drawn into battle on ground of Hannibal's choosing, where hidden reserves of Carthaginian cavalry could strike at the perfect moment. Lake Trasimene became the scene of the largest ambush in ancient history, as Hannibal's forces concealed themselves in the morning mist and fell upon Roman columns trapped between the lake shore and the hills. The systematic destruction of Roman armies sent shockwaves through the Mediterranean world as allied communities began to question their loyalty to a power that suddenly seemed vulnerable. Cannae represented the culmination of Hannibal's tactical brilliance, a battle where superior Roman numbers became a liability as the Carthaginian commander allowed his center to bend backward, drawing the legions into a killing ground where they could be enveloped and destroyed. The casualty figures strained credibility, with some accounts claiming 50,000 Roman dead in a single afternoon, including dozens of senators and hundreds of equites. The aftermath saw Italian communities switching sides, convinced that Roman power was finally broken and that their future lay with the Carthaginian cause. Yet Rome's response to catastrophe revealed the deep foundations of republican resilience built during centuries of Italian conquest. Rather than seeking peace, the Senate mobilized resources on a scale that astonished contemporaries, raising new legions to replace those lost while implementing a strategy of attrition designed to neutralize Hannibal's tactical advantages. Fabius Maximus earned the nickname Cunctator, the delayer, for his patient campaign of harassment that avoided pitched battle while gradually wearing down Carthaginian strength through constant skirmishing and disruption of supply lines. The war's turning point came through Roman strategic thinking that looked beyond Italy to the broader Mediterranean theater. While Hannibal remained dangerous but increasingly isolated in southern Italy, Roman forces under Scipio Africanus carried the fight to Spain, systematically dismantling Carthaginian power there and denying Hannibal the reinforcements he desperately needed. The capture of New Carthage demonstrated Roman adaptability as legions coordinated with naval forces to assault what had been considered an impregnable fortress city. Spanish tribes, impressed by Roman success and concerned about their own survival, began shifting their allegiance away from Carthage. The war's final act unfolded on African soil, as Scipio transported Roman legions across the Mediterranean to threaten Carthage itself. Hannibal's recall from Italy marked the end of his remarkable campaign, though his presence in Africa ensured that the conflict would conclude with a confrontation between the war's greatest commanders. At Zama in 202 BCE, Roman tactical evolution met Carthaginian desperation in a battle that demonstrated how completely the balance of power had shifted. Scipio's use of Numidian cavalry and his careful positioning of troops neutralized Hannibal's remaining advantages, while Roman discipline and training asserted themselves in the grinding combat that followed. The peace terms imposed on Carthage reflected Rome's emergence as the Mediterranean's dominant power, with restrictions on Carthaginian military forces and territorial control that effectively ended the maritime empire's independence. The indemnity payments would flow into Roman coffers for decades, funding further expansion while ensuring that Carthage could never again challenge Roman supremacy. More importantly, the psychological impact of victory established Rome's reputation as an irresistible force, encouraging submission from other powers while demonstrating the futility of resistance against Roman determination. With Carthage's power broken and its great rival reduced to ashes, Rome stood unchallenged in the Western Mediterranean, its legions seasoned by decades of warfare and its appetite for conquest sharpened by victory. The Second Punic War had transformed the Roman state from a regional Italian power into something far greater, something that now cast its shadow across the entire Mediterranean basin. Yet, victory over Hannibal had done more than expand Roman territory. It had awakened in Rome an awareness of the wider world beyond Italy's shores, a world rich with ancient kingdoms, sophisticated cultures, and treasures that glittered like stars in the eastern sky. The Greek world beckoned with its storied cities and legendary wealth. Here lay the kingdoms that had emerged from Alexander's shattered empire, Macedonia, under its Antigonid dynasty, the Seleucid Empire stretching across Asia Minor and beyond, and Egypt ruled by the Ptolemies from their magnificent capital at Alexandria. These were lands where philosophy had been born, where mathematics and astronomy had reached heights unknown in the Western world, where marble temples gleamed white against azure skies, and where libraries contained the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The very air seemed thick with history and learning, with the echoes of Pericles and Plato, of Aristotle and Archimedes. Rome's first steps into this eastern realm came almost reluctantly. wrapped in the familiar cloak of defensive necessity that had justified so many previous expansions. The Kingdom of Macedonia, under Philip V, had dared to ally itself with Hannibal during the darkest days of the Second Punic War. This transgression could not go unpunished, and in 200 BCE, Roman legions crossed the Adriatic Sea, their bronze-tipped spears catching the morning light as they marched onto Greek soil for the first time. The soldiers who disembarked from their transport ships found themselves in a landscape unlike anything they had known. Rolling hills crowned with olive groves, valleys where the marble columns of ancient temples rose like fingers pointing toward Mount Olympus, and cities whose very names carried the weight of legend. The Second Macedonian War unfolded with a precision that revealed just how formidable the Roman military machine had become. At Cynocephalae in 197 BCE, the traditional Macedonian phalanx, those bristling forests of 18-foot spears that had once conquered the known world under Alexander, met the flexible Roman manipular system in decisive battle. The sight must have been extraordinary. Thousands of Macedonian spearmen locked in their rigid formation, their bronze shields gleaming like scales on some enormous serpent, facing the more fluid ranks of Roman legionaries with their shorter swords and adaptable tactics. When the dust settled, the phalanx lay shattered, its reputation for invincibility broken forever on the hills of Thessaly. Philip V submitted to Roman terms, and suddenly Rome found itself the arbiter of Greek affairs, a role it had never sought but would never relinquish. The Romans proclaimed themselves the liberators of Greece, declaring the ancient city-states free from Macedonian domination. At the Isthmian Games near Corinth, a Roman herald announced this liberation to crowds of Greeks who wept with joy and disbelief. Yet this freedom proved as ephemeral as morning mist. Rome's definition of liberty differed markedly from Greek expectations, and within decades, Roman patience with Greek independence would wear as thin as silk stretched too tightly. The Seleucid king Antiochus III, sensing an opportunity in this apparent Roman restraint, invaded Greece with a massive army drawn from across his Asian domains. His forces included war elephants from India, Scythian archers from the steppes, and heavily armored cataphracts whose horses seemed to flow like liquid bronze across the battlefield. The confrontation at Thermopylae in 191 BCE carried deep symbolic weight. Here, where 300 Spartans had once held back the Persian tide, Roman legions now faced another Asian invasion, but this battle lasted mere hours rather than days. And when it ended, Antiochus was fleeing toward Asia Minor with the remnants of his grand army streaming behind him. Rome pursued him across the Hellespont, and at Magnesia, in 189 BCE, the Seleucid Empire suffered a defeat so complete that it never again posed a serious threat to Roman interests. The terms imposed on Antiochus were crushing: massive indemnities, the surrender of his war elephants, and the evacuation of all territory west of the Taurus Mountains. With each victory, Rome's entanglement in eastern affairs deepened. The third and final war with Macedonia came in 171 BCE, when Perseus, Philip's son, attempted to restore his kingdom's former glory. This conflict dragged on for 4 years, testing Roman resolve and revealing the growing sophistication of Roman diplomacy. Perseus had skillfully built alliances across the Greek world, promising to restore the Golden Age when Greek kingdoms dominated the eastern Mediterranean. His court at Pella glittered with ambassadors from distant kingdoms, and his treasury overflowed with gold intended to fund a war of liberation against Roman hegemony. The decisive battle came at Pydna in 168 BCE, where the setting sun cast long shadows across a field that would witness the final death throes of Macedonian independence. The phalanx made its last stand here, those ancient formations that had conquered Persia and reached India, grinding forward one final time against Roman steel. But the ground was uneven, and as gaps opened in the Macedonian line, Roman swords found their mark with deadly efficiency. King Perseus himself fled the field, his purple cloak disappearing into the gathering dusk as his kingdom died around him. Macedonia was divided into 4 republics under Roman oversight, its royal treasures shipped to Rome, where they would fund decades of public works and games. The cultural consequences of these eastern conquests proved as profound as the political ones. Roman soldiers returned from Greece with more than just spoils of war. They carried with them marble statues whose beauty exceeded anything previously seen in Rome, scrolls containing the works of Homer and Sophocles, and stories of libraries that contained hundreds of thousands of books. Greek slaves, many of them highly educated, flooded into Roman households as tutors and secretaries, bringing with them the accumulated intellectual treasures of Hellenistic civilization. Suddenly, wealthy Roman families competed not just in the accumulation of land and gold, but in the sophistication of their Greek learning and the elegance of their Hellenized lifestyle. The transformation was visible everywhere in the growing city of Rome. Greek architectural styles began appearing alongside traditional Roman forms, their marble columns and decorated pediments, creating a visual language of power and refinement that would endure for centuries. Roman temples incorporated Greek proportions and decorative elements, while private houses bloomed with Greek-inspired frescoes depicting mythological scenes and pastoral landscapes. The Forum Romanum itself gradually acquired a more cosmopolitan character as Greek influence seeped into every aspect of Roman public life. Literature and rhetoric flourished as Romans discovered the rich traditions of Greek poetry and oratory. Young men of noble families traveled to Athens and Rhodes to complete their education, returning with refined accents and philosophical sophistication that marked them as members of an emerging cultural elite. The Latin language itself began to evolve, incorporating Greek loanwords and adopting more complex grammatical structures that could accommodate the nuances of Hellenistic thought. Even Roman religion adapted, as Greek gods merged with Italian deities in a syncretic blend that reflected Rome's expanding worldview. Yet this cultural revolution was not without its critics. Conservative Romans like Cato the Elder viewed Greek influence with deep suspicion, seeing in it a corruption of traditional Roman values of simplicity, duty, and martial virtue. They watched with alarm as young Romans adopted Greek fashions, studied Greek philosophy, and sometimes seemed to prefer Greek culture to their own ancestral traditions. The tension between Hellenization and Roman identity would persist for generations, creating a dynamic cultural synthesis that was neither purely Roman nor purely Greek, but something entirely new, a Mediterranean civilization that would shape the Western world for millennia to come. The Greek campaigns had returned to Rome, laden with more than just spoils of war and captive scholars. They brought back something far more dangerous than any enemy army, the intoxicating taste of absolute power that came from commanding legions across distant lands, governing provinces rich with tribute, and wielding authority over vast territories where Roman law held sway. The very structure of Roman governance, built upon the careful balance of competing magistrates and the collective wisdom of the Senate, began to strain under the weight of these new imperial realities. In the marble corridors of the Curia, where senators had once debated the fate of neighboring Italian cities, conversations now turned to the administration of entire kingdoms. The traditional cursus honorum, that careful ladder of offices that had guided ambitious Romans through their public careers, seemed suddenly inadequate for men who had tasted the heady wine of proconsular command. Why should a general who had conquered Greece return to Rome to argue over grain distributions and judicial procedures when he could rule like a king in the provinces, surrounded by the deference of subjects and the luxury that came with absolute authority? The first cracks in the republican facade became visible in the figure of Titus Quinctius Flamininus, who had proclaimed Greek freedom at the Isthmian Games, yet lingered in his command, reluctant to return to the more mundane responsibilities of civilian life in Rome. His reluctance was understandable, for in Greece he was hailed as a liberator, his image struck on coins and his name carved into temple dedications. In Rome, he would be merely another ex-consul, bound by the same laws and customs as his peers. His imperium dissolved the moment he crossed the sacred boundary of the Pomerium. This pattern repeated itself across the Mediterranean world as Rome's sphere of influence expanded. Generals discovered that distant commands offered not just military glory but unprecedented opportunities for personal enrichment and political independence. The spoils of conquest filled private coffers as readily as the public treasury, and loyal veterans looked to their commanders rather than to distant magistrates for their fortunes. These armies, seasoned by years of campaign and bound to their generals by shared hardships and mutual profit, gradually transformed from instruments of state policy into personal followings. Marcus Licinius Crassus understood this transformation perhaps better than any man of his generation. His vast wealth, accumulated through property speculation and the profits of slave-worked mines, gave him the resources to raise and equip legions independently of state funding. When Spartacus and his fellow gladiators sparked their great rebellion, threatening the very heart of Italy with their ragtag army of escaped slaves and desperate men, it was Crassus who stepped forward with the promise of swift resolution. His legions, funded from his private fortune and commanded by officers who owed their positions to his patronage, crushed the rebellion with methodical brutality that left crosses lining the Appian Way from Capua to Rome. The sight of those crucified rebels, their bodies darkening under the Mediterranean sun, served as a stark reminder of what happened to those who challenged Roman authority. Yet they also symbolized something more troubling, the emergence of a new kind of power in the Republic, one based not on constitutional office but on personal wealth and military command. Crassus had saved Rome from servile war, but in doing so he had demonstrated that private citizens could wield armies and exercise authority traditionally reserved for the state. Cneius Pompeius Magnus embodied this new reality even more dramatically. Still a young man when Sulla's dictatorship ended, Pompey had already commanded armies in Africa and Spain, earning triumphs traditionally reserved for men who had held the consulship. His very cognomen, Magnus, proclaimed his exceptional status, while his youthful features became familiar to Romans through countless statues and portrait busts that emphasized his resemblance to Alexander the Great. When pirates threatened Rome's grain supply, choking off the vital shipments that fed the growing urban population, it was Pompey who received extraordinary command over the entire Mediterranean, with resources and authority that dwarfed those of any traditional magistrate. The Lex Gabinia that granted Pompey his anti-pirate command marked a crucial turning point in Roman constitutional history. For the first time, the People's Assembly had bypassed the Senate entirely to grant sweeping powers to a single individual. The precedent was ominous, suggesting that popular assemblies could be manipulated to circumvent traditional checks and balances. Pompey's swift success against the pirates only reinforced the lesson that extraordinary problems required extraordinary solutions, and extraordinary solutions inevitably meant extraordinary commands for extraordinary men. While Pompey swept pirates from the seas, another ambitious Roman was carving out his own path to power through different means. Gaius Julius Caesar possessed neither Crassus's wealth nor Pompey's military reputation, but he understood the changing dynamics of Roman politics with crystalline clarity. His early career followed traditional patterns, quaestor, edile, praetor, but at each stage he demonstrated an unprecedented willingness to court popular favor through lavish public entertainments and carefully calculated acts of generosity. His games as aedile featured gladiatorial contests on a scale that left audiences breathless and creditors nervous, while his brief stint as governor of further Spain provided just enough military experience to establish his credentials as a general. The informal alliance between these three men, Crassus with his gold, Pompey with his victories, Caesar with his cunning, represented the final transformation of Roman politics from a system based on institutional competition to one dominated by personal relationships and private agreements. Their secret compact, later known as the First Triumvirate, carved up commands and offices among themselves as if the Roman state were their private possession. Consuls and praetors continued to be elected, the Senate still met in its ancient hall, but real power lay elsewhere in private conferences between men who commanded legions and controlled vast resources. The streets of Rome itself began to reflect these changing realities. Political competition, once confined to speeches in the forum and votes in the assemblies, increasingly spilled over into violence and intimidation. Rival gangs, led by ambitious tribunes like Publius Clodius and Titus Annius Milo, fought pitched battles in the sacred precincts of the city, turning elections into armed contests where the outcome depended as much on organized violence as on political argument. The very center of Roman civilization, the forum where Cicero delivered his greatest speeches and where citizens had gathered for centuries to hear the latest news from the provinces, became a battlefield where Roman fought Roman with increasing brutality. These urban conflicts reflected deeper tensions within Roman society as the Republic struggled to govern an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. The old citizen soldier, who served his time in the legions before returning to his small farm, was disappearing, replaced by professional soldiers whose loyalty belonged to their commanders rather than to the abstract concept of the Roman state. Meanwhile, the city itself swelled with displaced farmers, foreign slaves, and ambitious men from across the Mediterranean world, all seeking their fortune in the capital of the emerging empire. The traditional Roman virtues, gravitas, dignitas, auctoritas, seemed increasingly irrelevant in this new world of personal armies and private compacts. The careful balance of powers that had served the Republic so well in its conquest of Italy proved inadequate for governing a Mediterranean empire, and the very success of Roman arms created problems that Roman institutions could not solve. Each new province brought new opportunities for wealth and power, but also new challenges to the delicate equilibrium that kept the Republic functioning. As the triumvirs pursued their separate ambitions, Pompey in the east, Caesar in Gaul, Crassus dreaming of Persian gold, the ancient city on the Tiber waited, its temples and basilicas still standing proud against the seven hills, but its political heart gradually failing. The Republic that had conquered the Mediterranean world was slowly consuming itself. victim of its own unprecedented success and the limitless ambitions of the extraordinary men that success had created. The blood-soaked fields of Actium grew quiet as the September sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the wreckage of Antony and Cleopatra's dreams. Octavian stood aboard his flagship, watching the last of the enemy vessels disappear into the gathering dusk, their oars cutting desperate rhythms through waters that had witnessed the final act of the Roman Republic. The young man who had once been merely Caesar's heir now commanded the entire Mediterranean world, his victory echoing across an empire that stretched from the mists of Britain to the burning sands of Egypt. In the aftermath of that decisive naval battle, as autumn winds carried news of triumph to every corner of the Roman world, Octavian faced a challenge more complex than any military campaign. The Republic lay in ruins, its institutions hollowed out by decades of civil war, its citizens weary of bloodshed and desperate for peace. The old ways had failed, crushed beneath the ambitions of generals who had turned Roman legions against Roman legions in an endless cycle of vengeance and conquest. Something new had to emerge from the ashes, something that could bind together the vast territories that Roman eagles had claimed in the name of a city that could no longer govern itself. The transformation began slowly, carefully, like the gradual changing of seasons across the 7 hills of Rome. Octavian understood that Romans cherished their republican traditions even as they yearned for stability, that the word king still carried the bitter taste of the Tarquin tyrants who had been driven from the city 5 centuries before. Rather than seize power with the crude methods of a conqueror, he moved with the subtle grace of a master sculptor, shaping a new form of government from the marble of ancient precedent. The Senate continued to meet in its hallowed chambers. Senators still wore their purple-striped togas and debated matters of state with the grave dignity their ancestors had displayed. But real authority flowed through different channels now, channeled through the person of one man who held multiple offices simultaneously. The year 27 BCE marked the formal beginning of what would later be called the Principate, though those who witnessed its birth might not have recognized the magnitude of the moment. In a carefully orchestrated ceremony that displayed all the theatrical flair Romans loved in their public rituals, Octavian appeared before the Senate to make a show of laying down his extraordinary powers, offering to return the state to its traditional republican governance. The senators, playing their assigned roles in this constitutional drama, entreated him to remain, to accept new titles and responsibilities for the good of Rome and its empire. They bestowed upon him the name Augustus, a word heavy with religious significance, suggesting one who was blessed by the gods and worthy of reverence. Augustus, as he would be known to history, emerged from this ceremony as something unprecedented in the Roman world. Neither king nor mere magistrate, but a figure who embodied the state itself while maintaining the fiction of republican government. He held the imperium of a consul without the yearly limitations of that office, commanded the loyalty of the legions through his role as imperator, and wielded the tribune's power to protect the people while standing above the tribunate itself. The genius of this arrangement lay not in its revolutionary nature, but in its conservative appearance, the way it wrapped radical change in the comfortable clothing of ancestral tradition. The physical transformation of Rome under Augustus reflected the broader changes sweeping through the empire. Marble temples rose where wooden shrines had stood, their columns gleaming white against the Mediterranean sky, their pediments carved with scenes celebrating Roman victories and divine favor. The Forum Augustum stretched its colonnades around statues of republican heroes, creating a gallery where past and present merged in harmonious celebration of Roman greatness. Aqueducts carried fresh mountain water into the city's fountains and baths, while new roads pushed outward from the capital like the spokes of an enormous wheel, binding distant provinces to the beating heart of empire. Poetry flourished in this golden age as never before, the verses of Virgil and Ovid capturing the optimism and grandeur of a world finally at peace. The Aeneid, with its tale of Trojan refugees founding a new civilization in Italy, provided Romans with an epic mythology that justified their dominion over other peoples while celebrating the virtues that had supposedly carried them to greatness. In these carefully crafted lines, destiny and duty intertwined, creating a narrative that transformed conquest into divine mission and made Augustus himself appear as the fulfillment of ancient prophecy. The Praetorian Guard took shape during these years, their bronze-scaled armor catching the sunlight as they stood watch over the imperial household. These elite soldiers, hand-picked for their loyalty and skill, represented a new reality in Roman governance. The acknowledgement that the emperor's person had become synonymous with the state's security. Their camp on the outskirts of Rome grew into a small city of its own, complete with training grounds and workshops where the finest weapons and armor in the empire were forged for those who served as the ultimate guardians of the new order. Provincial administration underwent subtle but profound changes as Augustus extended his personal oversight across the empire's far-flung territories. Governors still ruled in the name of the Senate and people of Rome, but increasingly they answered to the emperor's legates, men chosen for their competence rather than their political connections. This bureaucratic revolution brought unprecedented efficiency to imperial administration, creating systems of taxation, census-taking, and law enforcement that would endure for centuries. Local customs were respected where they posed no threat to Roman authority, while Roman law provided a common framework that gradually unified diverse peoples under a single legal tradition. The emperor's household itself became a center of governance, with freedmen and slaves managing correspondence that flowed in from every corner of the known world. These humble servants of the imperial family wielded influence that would have astonished the senators of earlier generations, as they drafted letters that could determine the fate of provinces and peoples. The palace on the Palatine Hill hummed with quiet activity as clerks copied documents, architects planned new monuments, and scholars debated questions of law and philosophy under the patronage of their divine patron. Military reforms consolidated the professional legions that had emerged during the late Republic, creating a standing army that served not Rome in the abstract, but Augustus personally. Veterans received land grants in colonies scattered throughout the empire, from the olive groves of southern Spain to the wheat fields of Gaul, binding former soldiers to the imperial system through grants of property and citizenship. These settlements became centers of Romanization, spreading Latin language and Roman customs into regions that had never known Mediterranean civilization. The imperial cult developed gradually, almost imperceptibly, as provincials began offering sacrifice to the emperor's genius and building temples in his honor. Augustus walked a careful line between accepting divine honors and maintaining republican sensibilities, allowing his worship in the East where such practices were traditional, while presenting himself as merely the first citizen among equals in Rome itself. This religious innovation would prove crucial to imperial unity, providing a focus of loyalty that transcended local tribal and ethnic divisions. As Augustus aged, the question of succession cast long shadows across the empire's future. The careful constitutional fiction he had constructed depended heavily on his personal authority and political skill, and no clear mechanism existed for transferring power to a chosen heir. The deaths of his grandsons Gaius and Lucius Caesar forced him to adopt his stepson Tiberius, a military commander of proven ability but questionable popularity. This succession crisis revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Principate. It claimed to be a restored republic while functioning as a monarchy, maintained republican forms while concentrating all real power in the hands of one man. The empire that Augustus bequeathed to his successors stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the Sahara to the Rhine, encompassing perhaps 50 million souls who now called themselves Romans, regardless of their ethnic origins. Peace reigned along frontiers that had known constant warfare for generations, while trade flowed freely along roads and sea lanes protected by Roman arms. The republican institutions that had governed a city-state proved remarkably adaptable to imperial administration, their forms preserved even as their substance was fundamentally altered to serve the needs of a world empire ruled by a single will. The golden age of Pax Romana settled over the Mediterranean world like morning mist over still waters, bringing with it a profound transformation that would echo through the centuries. Under Augustus and his successors, the Roman Empire had grown into something unprecedented in human history, a vast, interconnected realm where the same coins clinked in marketplaces from Hadrian's Wall to the banks of the Euphrates, where Roman law governed disputes in villages that had never seen an Italian legionnaire, where Latin mixed with local tongues to create new dialects that would one day become the Romance languages of Europe. The peace that Augustus had established was not merely the absence of war, but rather a living, breathing system of governance that touched every aspect of daily existence throughout the empire. Roads stretched like arteries across continents, their perfectly fitted stones worn smooth by countless sandals, cartwheels, and hoofbeats. Along these highways, merchants carried silk from China and spices from India to Roman tables, while ideas flowed as freely as goods. Greek philosophy merged with Roman pragmatism, Egyptian mathematics influenced Roman engineering, and mystery religions from the East found eager audiences in Western cities. The empire had become a vast organism, its different regions functioning like organs in a single body, each contributing its unique gifts to the whole. In the great cities that dotted the imperial landscape, Life had settled into rhythms that would have seemed impossible during the chaotic centuries of expansion. Rome itself had grown beyond all recognition, its population swelling to over 1 million souls who lived in apartment blocks that rose like urban cliffs above narrow streets. The Forum Romanum had become the beating heart of not just a city, but a civilization, its marble columns and bronze statues reflecting sunlight that seemed to illuminate the entire known world. Here, senators in pristine togas debated policies that would affect peoples they had never met, while foreign ambassadors in exotic dress waited for audiences that might determine the fate of distant kingdoms. The amphitheaters and theaters that graced every major settlement had become more than mere entertainment venues. They were laboratories of human nature, places where the diverse populations of the empire gathered to witness spectacles that both thrilled and unified them. In these stone circles, gladiators from Germania faced wild beasts from Africa, while crowds that included freed slaves from Greece, merchants from Gaul, and aristocrats from Spain cheered as one. The games had evolved beyond mere blood sport into elaborate theatrical productions that told stories of Roman virtue, recreated famous battles, and even staged mock naval conflicts in flooded arenas. These shared experiences created bonds between peoples who might otherwise have remained strangers, forging a common Roman identity that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries. The imperial consolidation that marked this golden age was perhaps most visible in the great building projects that transformed the urban landscape of the empire. Aqueducts carried fresh mountain water across valleys and over hills to nourish cities hundreds of miles from their sources, their graceful arches standing as monuments to Roman engineering prowess. Public baths became social centers, where citizens of all classes mingled in steamy luxury, their conversations echoing off marble walls as they discussed everything from local politics to philosophical debates they had heard in the basilicas. Libraries filled with scrolls and codices preserved the wisdom of ages, while new works by Roman poets and historians added fresh layers to the growing corpus of imperial literature. The Pax Romana had created conditions that allowed art and learning to flourish in ways that would have been impossible during the turbulent years of conquest. Poets like Virgil and Ovid crafted verses that captured both the grandeur and the gentle melancholy of their age, their words flowing like honey across parchment as they explored themes of love, loss, and the weight of destiny. Historians such as Tacitus and Suetonius chronicled the rise and fall of emperors with a precision and psychological insight that revealed the complex humanity behind imperial power. In workshops throughout the empire, craftsmen created mosaics of breathtaking beauty, their tiny colored stones forming images that seemed to capture light itself, scenes of daily life, mythological narratives, and geometric patterns that spoke of mathematical principles borrowed from Greek masters. The provinces had gradually transformed from conquered territories into integral parts of the Roman world, their local elites learning Latin and adopting Roman customs while still maintaining their distinctive regional characteristics. In Gaul, Druids who had once led resistance against Caesar now served as advisors to Roman governors, their ancient wisdom finding new expression within the imperial framework. Spanish olive oil and wine flowed to tables in Britain, while British wool warmed Roman citizens in the deserts of North Africa. This economic integration had created prosperity on a scale never before seen, with trade routes that connected the Atlantic shores of Portugal to the silk markets of Central Asia. The legal system that Rome had developed during its centuries of growth now provided a common framework for justice throughout the empire, its principles of evidence, advocacy, and precedent creating a stability that allowed commerce and culture to thrive. Roman jurists in marble halls debated fine points of law that would influence legal thinking for millennia, their careful reasoning creating a body of jurisprudence that balanced imperial authority with individual rights. The concept of citizenship itself had evolved, gradually extending its protections and privileges to peoples who had once been enemies, creating a sense of belonging that transcended the accidents of birth and geography. Yet beneath the marble facades and golden prosperity, subtle changes were already stirring that would reshape the empire's destiny. New religions from the East had begun to take root in Roman soil, their messages of spiritual salvation offering alternatives to the traditional pantheon of Roman gods. Christianity, born in the remote province of Judea, was spreading quietly through the urban centers of the empire, its promise of eternal life resonating with slaves and aristocrats alike. These mystery cults offered intensely personal relationships with the divine, divine, contrasting sharply with the formal civic nature of traditional Roman religion. The very success of the Pax Romana had created new challenges that would test the resilience of imperial institutions. The massive armies needed to defend the frontiers had become a drain on imperial finances, while the luxury and comfort of urban life had begun to distance the Roman elite from the harsh realities that had forged their ancestors' character. Barbarian tribes beyond the borders had grown stronger and more organized, learning Roman military techniques while maintaining their warrior traditions. The empire had reached a kind of equilibrium, poised between the momentum of its great achievements and the subtle forces that would eventually transform it into something entirely new. As the sun set slowly over the 7 hills of Rome, casting long shadows across the Forum where Cicero had once thundered against Mark Antony, the eternal cities seemed to embody all the contradictions and possibilities of human civilization. The empire that had grown from a collection of mud huts beside the Tiber had become a world unto itself, a place where the dreams and ambitions of countless generations had crystallized into stone and bronze, law and literature, roads and aqueducts that would outlast the very civilization that created them. In the growing twilight, the voices of citizens making their way home through narrow streets mixed with the distant sound of temple bells, creating a symphony of daily life that spoke of an order and stability that seemed as eternal as the stars beginning to appear in the darkening